Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's webcast, Centralizing Cloud Logs and Events with Microsoft Sentinel. Today, myself, Eric Johnson, and my co-presenter, David Hazar, are going to be walking you through the journey of a log file from AWS and from Google and inside of the Azure cloud as well into the Microsoft Sentinel workspace that we've got set up for a demo environment to show you how all of these different little connectors can be glued together to give you a central area to review your events, set up alerts, run books, and all the fun things that we know and love about Sentinel. With that, let's do some quick introductions here. After we do some introductions, I'll walk you through the intra-cloud logging aggregation. So that's really going to be focused on AWS and Google getting logs into a central bucket. And from that bucket, we'll then talk about the cloud data transfer patterns that we can use to get those moving from that cloud over into Sentinel. And then from there, I'll pass it over to David, who can walk you through the Sentinel data connectors and where those log files show up. And he can even show you a few fun queries for confirming that that data is arriving successfully. My name's Eric Johnson. If I haven't met you before, welcome to SANS and welcome to the Cloud Security Curriculum. I'm involved in several of our courses. The primary concept for this particular webcast is related to Sec 549, which David and I are working on together from an authorship perspective and also teaching several times a year. It's a relatively new course compared to some of the other ones in Sec 510 and 540 that I've been involved with for several years. My background is coming out of a development background many years ago. I've spent a lot of time in application security, moved into kind of operational or DevSecOps focused security, and then have been fairly cloud architecture and cloud assessment focused for the last 5 years or so. So I've spent a lot of time in a lot of different pockets of IT with a security focus, which is really fun when you are dealing with the cloud and you've got a lot of different technologies all coming together to build things out like what we're going to talk about today. So my contact information is on the slide. Feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn if you've got questions or if you want to chat about any of the topics that we've got going today in more detail. David, I'll pass it over to you if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump in.
Yeah, sure. Similar career path, started out as a developer, kind of did a variety of things that were not security specific, but in the technology space, moved around a bit because my first job, we went from 20 employees in IT down to 2 of us. And so I got a lot of broad experience there. Now I do a lot of consulting through my own company and through IANS. And then I also am a co-founder of Next Level 3, where we are building a service or have built a service for just-in-time access and authorization. I co-author this course in Management 516, which is building and leading vulnerability management programs. And then I'm also an instructor for Eric's other course, 540, one of his other courses, 540.
Awesome. Yeah, so feel free to reach out to either of us on LinkedIn. I think that's probably our most active social media at this point. David, are you active on any other ones or pretty much just LinkedIn?
Yeah, primarily LinkedIn. Yep.
Right on. Cool. So let's take a look at the first section of the webcast. So I titled it Intra-Cloud Log Aggregation. The concept here is that as you have a cloud, whatever cloud it is, usually in a very large enterprise, you're going to be focused on the hierarchy of resources with more your top level kind of root management account. You're going to have OUs underneath that for, security and for workloads and for maybe monitoring, logging, identity, a lot of the core pieces that are going to be required to operate that cloud. All of those different accounts or subscriptions or projects are going to be emitting log events. And the first thing you need to make sure that you're doing is getting all of those into one location and not leaving them in every individual account or subscription, because it makes it really difficult to monitor what's going on if you have to check in a lot of different locations for that data. So the first piece here is setting up centralized logging. On the Azure side, I will say it's relatively straightforward in Azure. Typically, you'd have one subscription, which in this diagram, I've called it monitoring, that would contain your more or less your audit log storage account for kind of long-term storage and archival. And what you would usually set up on that storage account is kind of an immutable lock policy where you would say, okay, every audit log that hits this storage account has to be retained for X number of years. Typically, it's a year to 3 years to 7 years, depending on the vertical that you're working in. And you can't delete that record for that period of time. So that's your data retention on audit logs. You might also set up a lifecycle policy that says, we'll leave this kind of in warm storage for 6 months to a year roughly, and then eventually that would transition into kind of cold storage to save you some storage costs. But that isn't necessarily the easiest way to query the data. So think of that as your backup, more or less, for your audit logs. In the Azure world, typically setting up a log analytics workspace is going to be the easiest way for you to actually run live queries against it. And you would decide, how long do I need to keep this information active? And you might choose like 90 days of live queries. And if you need to query further back, you can restore the data from your storage account next to it. Maybe you choose 6 months, a year. It just depends on your retention requirements and how deep or how long in the history you need to go as far as getting live queries against active events. So with those resources set up centrally in the org, you can now go into your kind of your group management group, and you can set up an Azure policy that just says diagnostics has to be turned on for every single subscription. And those activity logs will start to flow into that central log analytics workspace. So that's one source. Another source from Entra ID, you're going to want audit logs for users logging in and logging out and high-risk logins of things of that nature. So that's another piece that you need to get turned on. And then you go through resource by resource and decide, do I want diagnostic data for this particular resource? An example might be a key vault. If you need data for reads and writes for key vault secrets, for example, you might want Kubernetes audit logs, the whole control plane for Kubernetes, as far as creating pods or deleting services and things like that. Those are going to flow in through diagnostic events. And you may also choose to send all of that information into the central monitoring workspace. Azure policies can govern all of that. You can set up Azure policies that say it has to be enabled for these individual resource types. In Azure, with that setup, you pretty much have your central monitoring subscription with all the data that you need flowing into one location, which is going to be really important when David takes over and kind of shows you how to build Sentinel on top of that log analytics workspace to give you all of the different kind of SIEM and SOAR capabilities that you're looking for. Google Cloud centralized logging is also very straightforward. Google Cloud's audit logs is kind of an org level resource, and you can just go to Cloud Audit Logging, and there's a section where it says, how do you want to route these? And you simply just choose from an audit logging perspective, I would like to send all of my audit logs into a centralized logging project with a storage bucket in potentially a BigQuery instance that allows you to run very large scale queries against all of the data that's in that bucket. And that's really all you have to set up. Data plane logs are not enabled by default in Google Cloud. So there's no concept of resource by resource diagnostics like there was in Azure. You just pick for this service, I want the data plane logs. And when you turn that on, it'll just get run through that logs router the same way that the actual management control plane logs are. So that's a pretty simple setup over there, which I can show you here in a minute. AWS is by far the most complicated, I think, to set up, typically because you've got a number of different AWS accounts in your organization, and those accounts by default don't really have access to the resources cross account. So you have to do some work on the policy side to actually set that up. So if you go into CloudTrail, for example, and you configure your management and your data plane trails for the entire organization, and you're going to choose this central audit logs bucket that's inside of a monitoring account in your org. That's a cross account write from an S3 perspective. So what you'll have to do is actually go to that Delos monitoring account. You have to go to that S3 bucket, and you have to set up a bucket policy that says the CloudTrail service, which is cloudtrail.amazonaws.com, has the ability to put objects into this bucket conditionally if that CloudTrail ARN is from an account in my organization. So there's some access control logic involved there, more or less to make sure that you don't accidentally open up rights from other AWS accounts that are out there that belong to other tenants. That concept continues to evolve as you go into other different like kind of log sources inside of AWS. You'll have to do the same thing with the flow log service and with the guard duty service and the security hub service and inspector service to start aggregating all of the log data across your org into that central location. So it takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of kind of IAM policy guidance potentially from the docs or from folks that have set this up before. And then once you get there, I think it becomes normal, maybe. The complexity starts to feel like a day in and day out job. And then when you jump over to Azure and Google and you see how easy it is to do over there, you kind of just think, wow, it could be easier here. But that's just the way that it works. So my goal with our first walkthrough is going to really focus on getting this data centralized into the various monitoring or logging resources. And as part of David and I's Sec 549 class, we've got this Delos is the name of the company, this infrastructure built out in the clouds to demonstrate and show people a lot of these logging patterns as far as some of the things that we do in the class. So what I wanted to do is jump over to the organization that we've got set up. So if I jump into, for example, this management account, and I go to the CloudTrail record or the CloudTrail service, I wanted to show you how this is pointing to a bucket that's not inside of this account. So we go to CloudTrail and we kind of look at the different data plane and management trails here, and I'll just pick the data plane. It doesn't really matter. They're both sending it to the same location. You can see that it's sending it to this Delos SIEM audit logs live S3 bucket, which is not in this account. So this is going to be that cross account scenario that I walked you through. And you can validate it. If you go to S3, we're looking for that bucket in this account. You can see that, there is no bucket in here with that Delos audit logs name. So let's take a look over. We scroll through the org accounts and go to monitoring. That's where that bucket lives at. And if we go into the S3 service here, what we want to see is you take a look at that Delos SIEM audit logs live bucket. That's what we were pointing to. So every account in the org is going to be sending CloudTrail data over here. We'll click on this. And if we go to the permissions, this is where you're going to see that bucket policy that is starting to allow some of these services in the org to write to it. So we've got the delivery service in there. You'll notice if I kind of zoom in on our, let's zoom in just a little bit on this policy, and we take a look at the CloudTrail. Let's see. So that's for config, security hub. So here's your CloudTrail policy statement. So notice we're allowing CloudTrail, Amazon, AWS.com. So that's that service that we kind of configured up in the management account to put objects into this bucket. But we also are using a source org ID condition here to say that that CloudTrail service, which is a global service linked role inside of all of AWS for all tenants, can only write to this bucket if it's coming from my organization. So now every account in this entire list up on the org start page, they can write CloudTrail records into the bucket. It's going to inherit that management account setup where we said it's an org level CloudTrail. Every account that's in my organization is going to write to that bucket. And that's how you're starting to see the data that we've got here in the CloudTrail and the VPC flow log kind of subdirectories or prefixes here. That's how that data is getting there. So if you go to the AWS logs, you find all of these centralized zip files, essentially, that are all the management and the data plane actions that we've got set up. And that's one way to set up centralized logging inside of AWS. Now you just have to repeat that times all of the other services, guard duty, etc. And you will start to get all of the data where you need it so we can process it as we move forward with the conversation. Over on the Google side, if I go to, let me go to the org level here. So we're going to go up to our fake domain, the international management domain, and go to cloud logging. So we can go to the logging service, and this is more or less the equivalent. If I go to the let's see, we're going to look in our log router. So this is, once I've got this turned on, all we're going to look at is in the log router section. And you can see that I've set up two different log routers here. One is going to a cloud storage bucket, and the name is audit log storage. And then the other one is a pub sub topic, which we will get to on the next part of the conversation. For now, I just wanted you to see that all the logs are being routed to this GCS bucket, and that's in an individual account, or a project is what Google would call that. So if I go to the logging account, and then I go to cloud storage, see if I can spell right today. There's that audit logs bucket. So all the different audit logs are flowing in here from Cloud Audit. And you've got activity logs, you've got data access logs, and we've got these centralized inside of GCS for us to query if we want to from something like BQ. And that gives you the same feel that we just had over on the AWS side without all of the complex conditional logic in the bucket policy with JSON and all that fun stuff. So it's quite a bit more simple over here. As we look at Azure, we do have an Azure policy set up on this org. So let me go back to the homepage of Azure and let's zoom in on this a little bit so you can see it. But more or less, if you look at the subscriptions, there is an Azure policy on all of these subscriptions that are sending all of the data for different actions into a centralized log analytics workspace. And you can go into each of those subscriptions. And when David takes over, I'll let David show you kind of how those different subscriptions are routing into log analytics. And eventually we'll be able to query that info from Sentinel. But it's really straightforward on each subscription. The Azure policy, if I go to that, let's see, Azure policy. And you can see the one that we've got here that says, let me expand this just a little bit. Just says configure activity logs to stream to a specific log analytics workspace. So we can go to that and you can actually come in here and see which subscriptions are compliant, which ones maybe are non-compliant. Like maybe I created one that was not meeting our desired state configuration and it's being flagged here. And that'll tell us or the cloud administrators that they need to go fix that. But you can go through each of those and we can look at the details for this. It'll give you kind of the resource name, the type, and if you kind of take a look at the assignment on this, so let me see if I look at how I assign this, here's where we're starting to define, which workspace is this supposed to be going to? So where are we going to centralize it at? And you can take a look in one of our subscriptions, we've got a resource group called Delos Security Monitoring Prod Central. And if I go to Log Analytics, and look at the workspace, you can see that that central log analytics workspace is sitting here in that resource group that we just looked at, and Azure policy is pushing all of that down into the central log analytics workspace. So it gives us the same end result as AWS and Google, and now in Azure, we've got all of this centralized here. So let's pause for a moment. What we've been able to do now is take all of these different subscriptions, Google Cloud projects, and AWS accounts. And as activity is happening in all of them, we're getting all of the data into a single location inside of the whole org and all three clouds. So that's the intra-cloud piece to the conversation. The next setup is how do we start to cross-cloud aggregate the logs? And that's going to require some more advanced data movement. And ultimately, you choose where you want to send this information. It depends on what tools you've got available, how much money you want to spend. There's a lot of different considerations here as you look at moving data out of your cloud. In our scenario, what David and I, mostly from just talking to folks in the industry, just about every large enterprise has some sort of footprint already inside of Microsoft. Normally, Entra ID is the entry point, O365, and a lot of the Office suite, obviously lots of Windows boxes. So as time has gone on and Microsoft has built out their SIEM model, Sentinel seems to be the one that everybody is landing on as far as cloud SIEMs and doing managed kind of SIEM and log analytics. It doesn't have to be. There's a lot of folks that are still running kind of Splunk on-prem or even using Splunk Cloud. There's a lot of cool open source projects out there that you could put where this little SIEM logo is here. But the idea here is that as you start to go through different sorts of log types, so it could be event logs, it could be management plane, it could be data plane logs, it allows you to stream those out of the cloud environment and then push those or pull them into a SIEM, whatever type of SIEM you have. But I think the one thing David and I have learned is that when you make the selection of your SIEM, you need to be very careful about designing a logging architecture too early, because a lot of times the cloud providers are very prescriptive about how you're going to push the data from the cloud down into your SIEM. So you have to make sure you read through their requirements and their integrations first, and then you can start to design this. Typically, as you look at data transfer patterns and you're going through the SIEM and the cloud provider documentation, you're going to see two types of ways to move cloud data around. So one of those options is a push-based architecture, and that's for real-time data streaming. So if you've got logs inside of any of those three clouds, so AWS, Azure, or Google, you can essentially, as a log hits the stream, the data stream. So I would go back in, for example, to that Azure diagnostics configuration. Instead of pushing them into a log analytics workspace, I can push them off basically into an event grid. And that event is going to hit a live log stream. And then that can stream straight into like a Splunk HTTP event collector, something like that. The pull-based architecture is the other direction, where instead of having the logs real-time streamed, we're going to just notify maybe somehow, some way, the SIEM that a new log file is available, and then the SIEM can turn around and pull that data in. So it's not a real-time data stream. It does introduce a little bit of latency, just waiting to check for new data and pull it. But at the same time, the receiver can pull data when it's ready instead of having to be prepared to accept the live stream, which sometimes it can get overwhelmed as too much information comes in at once. So those are the two different patterns that you've got to choose from. Now you've got to go into your various documentation for the cloud and or the tooling that you're using and figure out which one is the best one to use. So on the AWS side, there's a couple of options. A lot of data streaming you will see using Kinesis. So Kinesis is their data movement service. It supports actually pushes and pull-based patterns. So if I was going to set up, for example, an integration with Splunk, you could go to Splunk and you can go to their documentation and say, okay, how do I ingest data from AWS? And it would say, okay, if you want a real-time stream, you set up the data fire hose in Kinesis, and you can forward that data in near real time straight into Splunk's HTTP event collector. However, if you want to use a pull-based pattern, you can also switch gears a little bit. And something like Graylog or a tool that maybe doesn't support real-time data streaming would say, create a Kinesis data stream, which is going to create shards of data or small chunks of it. And you can use Graylog to say, just go check for new chunks of data, and it will pull that data over when it's ready. So Kinesis is one of the export services available that you've got. There's also another export pattern, which is going to be more of a notification and then a pull-based pattern. So if you take a look over on this design, you've got all this data flowing into that centralized S3 bucket. So it's important to note here, this isn't a real-time data stream. There may be some delay getting that log data into S3, which it varies by service, also just by what day of the week it is, because AWS usually in the docs will say something like, well, it'll be there between 5 and 15 minutes later. And there's no guarantee really of that SLA. Sometimes they're really fast, and most of the time it is really fast, but they're leaving themselves some leeway to say, you know, if we're having a rough day or there's network congestion or things like that are going on, it might take 10 minutes for that VPC flow log to show up. So when that record hits S3, you can set up an event notification on the bucket, and that event notification would send a message into a queue, basically an SQS object. In the queue, we'll just have X number of messages saying new log file, new log file, new log file. And then over on the data consumer side, your SIEM or a function or a VM can just basically pull messages off the queue, process them one by one by one. And as it processes it, it'll have the pointer to the new log file, and it'll pull that over from the bucket. So that's a more or less a notification and a pull pattern combined into one. And you'll see that used here in a little bit, because that's the pattern that Sentinel selected when they set up the data connector between Sentinel and AWS. So again, I'd love to real-time stream in the Sentinel, but you're kind of restricted by the decisions that some of the providers have made on how these things work. The Event Hub in Azure is the real-time data streaming service. So as you take a look at all of your diagnostic settings, I showed you one of the diagnostic settings that said send all the data to a log analytics workspace. Another option would be send it straight to storage for that long time archive. The third option is real-time streaming, and you can more or less send all of those different logs that we looked at up front in the conversation directly into an event hub. And that event hub can then turn around on the other side and have a bunch of consumers that are subscribed to it to receive that data. So you go to the documentation for any sort of data consumer like Splunk or Graylog or whatever, and it just says, here's how to read data from Microsoft's Event Hub. You set that up, and now you've got the real-time log streaming from Azure heading into your final destination. On the Google Cloud side, PubSub is the service that's most commonly used here. So the PubSub service allows you to set up real-time streaming or a pull-based architecture, and either way will work. So inside of PubSub, you create basically a topic, and that topic would be called audit logs, for example. And then over on the other side, you go to your SIEM or your Sentinel and you say, I want to subscribe to the audit logs topic. Here is the service account I'm going to use to pull data out of that topic. And you'll start to see that information flowing as well once those connections are set up. So those are the three different clouds, the different sorts of pull and push architecture patterns that you can use. At this point, I'm going to show you the quick demo. What I'm going to look at is on the AWS side, what resources did I need to set up to get data from that central audit logs bucket into Sentinel. And then on the Google Cloud side, we'll take a look at the resources that are required to get that data into Sentinel as well. So let's jump back over into our monitoring account. If you remember in AWS, we left off on the central S3 bucket. And that S3 bucket is now collecting all of the data that we want centrally in the org. There's a couple of things that needed to happen here in order for this to work. The first one is that you're going to need to set up a cross-account role with permissions for that external SIEM to pull the data. If you're not using real-time streaming, you're going to have to pull data. Pull data requires authentication. So if I go to the IAM service and we find in our list of roles here, the Sentinel role, on the AWS side, what I had to do is create permissions for this role to read data from that S3 bucket that I care about and the SQS queue that's going to be collecting the information. We've also got some customer managed keys encrypting all this data. So you're going to need a policy that allows this role to also decrypt data with that key in order for everything to work. So these are the permissions required to actually read data from the queue and read data from S3. On the other side of it, you're also going to need a trust relationship, which says, how can some external account or external identity assume this role to get those permissions? Now, AWS has a lot of different ways to do this. Federated identity is an option. You can do it through SSO, single sign-on. You can also just do cross account, which is what you're seeing here through the assume role action. So the original way that Microsoft set this up was they created their own AWS account. And that AWS account is owned by them. It's centralized to the Sentinel service. And what they're saying is we will, from this central AWS account, assume your role. And this external ID is kind of a random nonce, if you want to think of it that way, that's unique to me, that prevents some other customer potentially from assuming this role if they know the ARN and they're inside of this account. So you set that trust policy up, and that's going to allow Sentinel from the AWS account to pull audit log data from the queue and from storage into their AWS managed account. And then from there, they're feeding that back into Sentinel. Now, David did tell me kind of leading up to the discussion that there is another option as well where they can use federated identity to do this, which is how we set it up over on the Google Cloud side. So it sounds like there's a couple of options there now that you can use. So that role has to be there first. And then if you follow the trail here, so I showed you earlier how audit log data from CloudTrail is hitting the audit logs bucket. If you go to the properties on this, what you're going to see is that we've got some event notifications that say whenever one of these log files hits CloudTrail AWS logs, for example, we're going to send that notification to the queue. So now when a new log record comes in, it goes to a queue. That queue is going to contain how many current log entries have yet to be processed by Sentinel. So this queue here might have 1 or 10 or 20 pending messages. And then over on the other side, Sentinel can check the queue and say there's 10 messages waiting for me. It can pull all 10 off, and then it can turn right back around using the data in the message and read the objects from S3. And now we're back down to 0 to process. So that's how that data is being made available to Sentinel inside of AWS. On the Google Cloud side, I mentioned to you earlier that if we looked at the cloud logging routers, and we jump back into that particular section. So you want to go to your log routers. There was the log, oh, this is at the project level. Let me get back to the org level here. There was the cloud storage bucket, which is our long-term kind of retention. What I want to look here now is this pub sub topic. So pub sub is the data streaming kind of pull push architecture option. And so now when logs are created, we're sending it to this Sentinel audit log pub sub topic. So if we go back to the logging project and we look at pub sub, we're going to see that topic sitting there. And we can open that up and we can take a look at the topic, and then we've got one subscription to it. And that's the subscription that's going to be reading the data out. So if I go to the subscription, you can see everything kind of sitting here. We've got some activity as far as messages are hitting the pub sub topic. We're making those available to whoever has got access to read from this pub sub topic. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that federated identity was what was used over on the Google side for Sentinel to log in. You can find that if you go to the IAM and admin section of GCP. The first thing we had to do was create a workload identity federation setup. So if I go to workload identity federation, notice I've got an identity pool here for Sentinel to sign into the project with. And if I open up the identity pool, you can very quickly see it's an OpenID Connect pool. If I view the properties for this, I've got this particular issuer URL. That is the issuer for Microsoft's Sentinel service, kind of inside of their fabric. So the Sentinel service can issue JWTs with this issuer with a very specific audience. And with that JSON web token, I can use the service account here. So I've got this service account called Sentinel Connector, and that service account has permissions to read data from the pub sub topic. So Sentinel can essentially say, here's my JWT, authenticate to the workload identity pool, impersonate the service account, and then read data from pub sub in order to get the information over onto the other side. So with that, David, I'll pass it over to you, and you can wrap up the second half of the presentation and walk everybody through the Sentinel setup.
All right, give me a second here. I'm in a hotel room, so I'm dealing with one screen today. Usually I have multiple, and it's a little bit easier to do this. I just realized. All right, so let's get this shared. That's all right. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's talk about this integration we have. First, we're going to just talk about some of the different options that we have in the cloud for setting up a centralized SIEM. And we're not going to really talk about the third-party options. Obviously, there's Splunk Enterprise Security, there's QRadar, there's Logarithm, there's a whole bunch of ways that we can consolidate our SIEM. But in the cloud, for the different cloud vendors, in AWS, there's kind of a solution. You've got your Amazon Security Lake, which is essentially just really more of like a reference framework. I think it's a little bit more streamlined for setting it up than doing it on your own. But you have an S3 bucket, you have their glue service for ETL, you've got Lambda that you can use to help you with the automation and transformation as well. And that can store all of your log data. You can get your CloudTrail there. You can send data across cloud because it's just an S3 bucket. And then you can use a service like Athena to query that out. Now, what I haven't tried and what I haven't seen is when you get the log data in there from the other cloud providers, how easy is it to set up the queries to parse all of that with Athena? Because it understands, and there's actually help articles on how to structure these like virtual tables that you have to create in order for it to know how to, ungzip and decode that JSON so that you could actually do your SQL queries. So that would be something that would be interesting to try. I haven't actually tried that yet. On the Azure and Google Cloud side, they do have SIEM products, SIEM platforms that maybe are a little bit more similar to kind of what we've used on premises, right? So they've got their data stores in Azure. You've got your log analytics workspace that we already saw, and that's going to be where all those logs are housed. But now Sentinel can connect to that. You can do the queries with the Kusto Query Language to kind of mine that data and look at the raw log data and set up metrics and alerts. You can also set up workbooks and things like that. And we'll see some of that in the walkthrough. And on the Google Cloud side, you have Chronicle. Now, one thing that I should mention is that AWS also has a CloudTrail data lake service where you can get, within AWS at least, a more managed service for setting up and configuring the CloudTrail and some of the other security events and alerts and centralizing that inside of AWS. The one caution that I have there is, last time I looked at their documentation, because things change all the time, so I have to always caveat that they didn't have the ability to do any sort of custom tables or custom logs. And so that's why we've mentioned here the Amazon Security Lake, because that does have a little bit more customizability. But in the CloudTrail data lake, they say that, you query it with SQL. It's not S3 on the back end. I don't know what it is. They didn't say that in their documentation, but it does have that SQL query capability, which you can get with S3 with Athena. But as I mentioned, there's some extra work to make that data queryable. All right, so for the upcoming demo, we're going to be using Sentinel because that's what we have set up in our demo environment for 549. And getting the data from Azure into Microsoft Sentinel is easier, obviously, right? You're already there. You already have centralized it, as Eric has shown you, into that log analytics workspace. And when you set up Sentinel, you're just pointing it at that log analytics workspace, and that gets all of your Azure logs, but not all of your Microsoft logs. Okay, so wait. There's differences? Yeah, there are, right? So Azure is a piece of Microsoft. It's one fairly large piece, but there's other things out there that we need access to. If you're using Azure DevOps, well, that's not Azure, even though it has Azure in the name. It's actually a separate part. In fact, for 540, I was working with a student. They were having some issues with their Azure DevOps account that we were using back in the day for some of our CI/CD, and we contacted support. And after a while chatting with Azure support, they're like, "Oh no, this isn't us. You need to talk to Microsoft." And I'm like, "Oh wait, I thought I was talking to Microsoft," but it's a different piece. And so there are going to still be data connectors that you have to use within Sentinel, even though it's all Microsoft data. But we've got to connect to Entra ID, and we've got to connect to some of these other services to ingest and pull in those logs. It's still fairly straightforward. When we look at the data connector configuration for Entra ID, you're just checking boxes of the logs that you want to pull in from Entra ID. So it's not anything major that we have to set up with identity providers and cross account, cross cloud permissions and things like that. For assuming those roles or those impersonating those service accounts, but we do have to go through and check those boxes. And in fact, when I was preparing for the demo today, I realized, hey, this Entra ID data connector, there's like more logs here than there were before, and we're not pulling all of those in. And so that's something to keep in mind: is these things change over time. The cloud's constantly changing, and we have to. Just because we've set up something in the past, we have to kind of revisit that every once in a while to make sure that we're not missing any of those new features and new capabilities. All right, so for AWS, we kind of already saw the AWS side of this, where when we set up that data connector inside of Azure, we're assuming that role. That role is the thing that has access to pull the data from those queues. And so the data is getting sent by CloudTrail over to our S3 bucket, stored there. Then it's getting forwarded onto these message queues. And that's where this role is then picking up those messages and pulling them into Azure Sentinel. And we'll see some of that configuration here in a moment. On the Google Cloud side, same thing. Eric already showed you how it's getting into these pub sub topics, and then we have a subscription that Sentinel service account has access to. And he also showed you that identity provider and the service account associated with that has the ability to pull that into Sentinel. And this will create, in AWS, we'll see a couple different tables. We haven't set up all the different log streams like from Security Hub and everything, but we have the flow logs. We have our CloudTrail, which contains most of the, it has all the control plane and some of the data events that we've decided to synchronize over there. On the Google Cloud side, we've just got those audit logs, which contain both the audit information and the data access logs that we're sending over to that storage bucket, but also to the pub sub topic. And so this is what our centralized SIEM architecture looks like. We've got all of the different cloud providers pushing or pulling the data actually into this log analytics workspace. And then we're going to be able to use Sentinel to not only query the data, but also set up workbooks and notebooks and playbooks, which are all different things. And we can talk about what the differences are there, as we go through the demo. And then we're also pulling in not only our activity logs, which is our control plane, but also those diagnostic logs and stuff from Entra ID. We could be ingesting, if we're Office 365, we could be pulling in all of those logs as well into this log analytics workspace. And that's what Sentinel is attached to. In fact, when you look at if you remember what that external ID was on the AWS side that we're using, that was actually our unique GUID for the log analytics workspace. And that's how they ensure that that's different for me than it is for other customers, because that's a key piece of making that connection secure. Now, their new way of doing this is through OpenID Connect, just like the Google example. That must be fairly new because we didn't set this up that long ago, and they've already transitioned from this older style of the cross account access to the newer federated model. And we'll see that when we look at the data connector settings. If you want to understand the purpose of that external ID and why it needs to be separate for different customers, take a look up just AWS confused deputy. And that will kind of explain and walk through why, when you're integrating with third-party services, that you're allowing to assume your roles in your accounts, that external ID is very important. All right, so let's take a look and see, is this log data actually there? How does it get there? How do we set this up on the Azure side? And so here's our Microsoft Sentinel workspace, and we can do some queries here. We'll come back and do that here shortly, but let's first take a look at our data connectors. So down here we have our data connectors. It'll take a second for all these to load. We already see our GCP one right here, but let's take a look at our AWS one first. Hold on, I'm just trying to get rid of some of these Zoom windows. All right. So here is our Amazon Web Services S3 connector. There are multiple connectors. This is the newer one. And so it's the one that's recommended. And if we go down here, there is a PowerShell script that makes this setup a lot easier. So you download their setup scripts, you run this PowerShell script after you've set up your CLI and everything with your AWS credentials. And you have your workspace ID here. That's going to be used for that external ID. So it already tells you what you need to use there. You can also look that up by just going to the log analytics workspace. But they've made it easy. You don't even need to go over here to take a look at it. But just to show you that it's the same value over here, here's our workspace ID. All right, so we could go look at that PowerShell script, but that'll take too long. So we're going to go into the manual setup here just to show you what it is that we would need to do in order to set this up in our environment if we weren't using the script. So down here, we have, where is it? That's the automatic setup. All right, here's the manual setup. And now you can see that instead of doing that role assumption with whatever AWS has set up inside of that account that we referenced inside of our trust policy for that role, we can now set up, similar to what we saw on the Google Cloud side, some of these values will be identical to what we used to set up Google Cloud, right? The provider URL or the issuer here, we've got the audience. We set those values within our identity provider configuration on the AWS side. And just to show what that looks like real quick, I'm going to hop over to AWS real fast. And if we go inside of our account here and go over to IAM, here's identity providers, and we can set up a new provider here. This is where we'd go through, we'd select OpenID Connect, we'd put in our provider URL and our audience. And then there's some additional work to set up the trust policy, which is a little bit different than the trust policy, how it's set up now. And they give you all this information. It's all part of that script. Here we're referencing that identity provider, and then we have our audience here that we're checking, and then that role session name, which includes that workspace ID on the end. And so it's just a slightly different way of assuming that role over on the AWS side to get that connectivity to then pull the data from our message queue. All right, so now let's look at the GCP configuration. If we go back to our data connectors here, and we'll pull up the pub sub one and open that up. This is, we have our tenant ID, and then here's the logging project that we're federating to. And in order to set this up, they've got, instead of PowerShell, they've got some Terraform scripts to help us. And then Eric already showed you the identity provider, the service account. That's really what's enabling us to go over to Google's cloud and pull the data from the pub sub topic. Is that service account connection through that OIDC capability. Well, OIDC allows us to impersonate that service account, allows Azure to impersonate that secure service account to pull in that data. And then one last thing on the data connectors before we take a look at some of these queries. Here's our Entra ID connector. And you see here, we have a bunch of different logs that we can choose from here. Now we're logged in as a read-only user, so we can't select them, but we have our service principal logs, we have non-interactive users, managed identities, provisioning logs. We've got ADFS if you're still using Active Directory federation services, risky users, other things that we can enable here. We actually do have the sign-in logs. I think if you go over here, it says we're ingesting the sign-in logs. I don't know why it's unchecked here. Got to figure that out at some point. Maybe we turned it on before they started requiring P1 or P2 licenses. And so we got grandfathered in, but eventually we'll have to figure out why we still have that connected, but it's not checked here. And it could be that there's some flaw in their UI that just doesn't check that, even though it's enabled. But we are getting those logs. We can go look at some of that log data. So now let's go back here and let's look at some of these queries. For AWS, it's kind of nice. They have a few built-in queries here. And so we can just search for AWS. And if we want to see our console sign-ins, we just click that query and run it. Now, the problem is, if we look here, like, what are these other usernames? Like, why am I seeing a username for one of these, but not for the others? And that comes down to the fact that we're using IAM Identity Center for most of our logins. This login here was a regular IAM login with an account that I have for making modifications to the lab environment. And so that was a a more traditional IAM login. These other ones are role assumption. I log into the IAM Identity Center, and then when I select these different accounts here, I'm actually assuming a role inside of one of those accounts with a certain permission set assigned to it. And so what I have over here, I've actually gone through and parsed out from one of the other fields. Let me copy this over here, and then I'll talk through what is happening with this username. So before we're just pulling out this user identity username. Now, if we take off this summarization here and we look at the other fields, we see over here this user identity principal ID. And while for the one that has a username, we don't actually see that username anymore, we do see for the student user, right? That's the user I'm logging in with for the IAM Identity Center through our Azure connection. So we have it federated over to Azure. That's the user that's coming back. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to, when the other username is blank or empty, I wanted to parse off the second part of this because I don't really care about this unique identifier on the beginning there. I want to see what user it is. And so I set up a modification here. I'm just going to replace this real quick with this command here, or this change here, that we're setting up the username field. I'm just going to call it username, and we're doing an if statement. If that user identity username that is only filled in a little bit of the time is empty, then we're going to split this user identity principal ID on that colon and take the second, because it's zero-based array. We're going to take the second part of that and use that as the username. Otherwise, we're just going to use that user identity username because it exists if it's not empty. And so now if we run this, we have a username field. And so these built-in queries are nice, but you may want to make some modifications from them. The other cool thing about KQL is now I can just come in here and let me get rid of this so that it doesn't mess me up later. With the render, I can render this as, let's see, a bar chart. Because I'm doing a summary there. I forgot my pipe symbol. And so now you can see here, we have the different accounts. And if I wanted to change it so it was by username, I would just have to move that in front of account. And then it would separate by username first and then by account. So it's kind of stacked these where I can hover over this and I can see the different usernames for the different accounts that are logging in. Now for GCP, unfortunately, if we type in GCP or Google here, there's no queries, but we can go back to the tables over here. And if we look at the Sentinel tables, we see there's GCP audit logs. And so what we can do here is we'll just do a simple query just because of time here. Where is it? No, I can't. All right. And we'll do a take, I don't know, 10. And then we could set up our own queries, right? And we could kind of mirror some of the queries that we saw from AWS if we wanted to do that. Now, really quickly to kind of go over some of the different features here, you've got workbooks, which are really your dashboards. In the cloud, you've got notebooks, which are Jupyter notebooks that you can use for doing a little bit more, like adding in some code. You've also got some pre-built correlation and threat intelligence that's coming in, and you can build your own on top of that. And then the automation down here at the bottom, those are your playbooks. And so workbooks are essentially dashboards. Notebooks allow you to do a little bit more customization and create some more dynamic reports. And then automation, your playbooks are your automation, where you want to actually take action on specific events. All right. So just to wrap things up, make sure that you first are centralizing within your cloud, right? You want to make sure that you have a central data point there, and then you got to decide what you want to export to your SIEM, because you might not want to send all of it. There's a cost to synchronizing these alerts. There's egress charges. There's the storage charges. If you're storing this in your SIEM in the cloud, you're now storing it in 2 different places and you're getting charged twice. So you may want everything in there. You may be okay with synchronizing the most valuable information to your SIEM, the things that you're going to alert on right away. And then if you have to go research something, you can go into those individual data lakes that we have in the other cloud providers. And then if you decide that that's something that you're doing too often, you can start to synchronize more data over into your SIEM. Think about the different ways you can integrate. There was a question about the user logs or the event logs and which was being synchronized over. And I kind of answered that it was both, and it is both. We saw that there was the Entra ID logs, there was the activity logs, you've got your CloudTrail, your GCP. That works great for platform as a service and for all of the things that they're managing. But what it doesn't get always is your operating system logs. Those are going to be stored separately. They're going to be a different format, which might not be pulled over by those data connectors. Now, Microsoft is just hoping that you install Microsoft Arc Agent and get those operating system logs into Sentinel just kind of natively on all of your cross-cloud assets, but that might not be the case. So that might be a piece where you need to do some more integration to get those operating system logs for your infrastructure as a service assets. But anything that the cloud is logging for you natively as part of CloudTrail or the Google Cloud Audit logs or the data logs that are going in there, that's going to get synchronized over. It's the extra system and platform logs that are like kind of internal to those systems and platforms that may need some extra work there. So that's just a clarification on that answer. And then make sure that you're paying attention to those guides. Like, you don't have to do this on your own. There are those pre-built data connectors as part of the marketplace, and they do update over time. So go back and research those, see if there's a better way, more secure way to do that. See if there's more log data available for you to consume that you have to do something different to set up, as we saw with Entra ID. And then the workload identity, that OpenID Connect for cross-cloud, that is the way to go. We do not want to deal with these long-lived credentials, which are a little bit more common in AWS than the other cloud providers. But now we have a solution to that, right? So setting up those identity providers and using that to allow other people to assume roles in our accounts, or even for our own internal cross-cloud communication, is the way to go. Just a quick mention, we have a series of workshops going on right now. If you go to sans.org/ACE135, you can get some details there. We've got one coming up in June. Ahmed, who's one of the other 540 instructors, is going to be talking about containerization for our Aviata Cloud workshops for the next in the series. There's also 2 other ones that have already occurred that you can go back and look at. And we've got lots of different cloud courses for you to choose from. Eric and I are 540 and 549, but Brandon Evans, who did one of the workshops previously, is our cloud security controls and mitigations. And we've got threat detection and logging courses, pen testing, cloud pen testing as well, which was, I think, our first workshop was Moses that did that one. All right, any final questions or thoughts? Eric, you got anything?
Nothing here. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we will catch you next time around.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, wait, looks like we got something. Yeah, so the question was, would you really store everything in a data lake without pre-filtering? It just really depends. Like you sometimes need to get down to the real detail of what's happening. And so maybe you would store everything for 30, 90 days. Like a lot of these data lake capabilities have retention policies. And so 90 days, we keep everything. Then we start to do our filtering. That's on a per cloud basis. And then we filter before we create that centralized log, or we centralize with our SIEM, right? So we could already be filtering there. And then still have the full details in our individual data lakes in each cloud, and then have retention policies if it's costing us too much money to store all that data, or we find that it's no longer valuable after 30, 60, 90 days, we can start to get rid of some of that data inside of that data lake. And then if we find that we're going back to that data lake too much and it's slowing down our response, then we need to increase the amount of data that we're sending over to our consolidated centralized SIEM platform. But yeah, good question. All right, well, happy Wednesday, everybody. Well, maybe not everybody, depending on what area of the world you're in, but have a great week.